Hello, and welcome to the Moss Adams presentation, How to Prepare for Your Enterprise Software's End of Life. Before we begin, there are a few things you should know that will improve your participation in today's session. We want this webcast to be interactive for you, so if you have questions, please use the Q&A widget for questions by typing in your question and pressing the Submit button. You can access today's presentation material and related content in the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. Due to its abbreviated nature, the session is not eligible for continuing professional education credit. And finally, the material appearing in this presentation is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as advice of any kind, nor is information intended to create, and receipt does not constitute a legal relationship. If you require professional advice, please contact a Moss Adams professional. Knowing when and how to transform from one system to another can be both confusing and stressful, which is why I'm so pleased to have Greg Price, Director in our Enterprise Systems Consulting Services, presenting on this topic today. For nearly 40 years, Greg has served over 2,100 clients in 24 countries around the globe. He brings financial and accounting savvy and risk awareness to helping clients maneuver through dynamic digital transformation and to fully grasp what this means. Greg is truly an essential advisor who helps business owners achieve their goals around financial profitability, sales growth, and business intelligence by providing the right solutions from the wide variety of enterprise and software solutions available today. Greg is a member of the advisory board for the Rice Alliance for Innovation and Technology and has held advisory board member positions with several leading technology groups, including the Houston Technology Center, Texas A&M Center for New Ventures, the Microsoft Partner Advisory Board, and LSU Stevenson Entrepreneurship Institute. We count on Greg's expertise to make a difference with our clients and are pleased to have him with us today. Greg, I'll put our audience in your capable hands. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tanya, for the introduction. I very much appreciate that. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking time to visit with us today on this really important topic as we move forward with our digital transformation in our worlds. There's a lot going on in technology today, and today we'll just talk for a few minutes about a topic that is probably near and dear to many of you, the end of software life. So we'll get into that a little bit. We have an agenda here today, which will kind of outline what we want to do. So let's take a quick look at that. First, I'm going to review with you kind of a little bit about the legacy of software and how did this end-of-life philosophy get to where it is today. So this is not something that just happened. It's been going on for a long time. And in any journey, it's also important to know where you're starting from before you can get to your future state. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you can take a current state assessment of where you are, and that will help you as you plan to go forward. I reached out to a number of you who had registered for the webinar, and of course, the meat of the program will be talking about upgrading versus replacing. So we'll try to do this in a positive way by talking about the pros of each of these particular situations. Everybody's situation is different and unique, and it's important for you to have a little bit of a foundation from which to go through and make these assessments. In addition, a number of you have also mentioned to me when I reached out to you about organizational change management, and I have a different word for that, and we'll cover that a little bit later on. But the people issues associated with technology are also very important and sometimes get overlooked when we're trying to evaluate, what do we want to do and what's important for the organization. And then lastly, we'll cover the next steps. So how do you get to your future state? So let's pick up on the legacy and the philosophy of end of life. So what we're seeing going on today is not unlike what we saw in the late 60s and the early 70s. As a matter of fact, some of you probably weren't around at the time, But next year will be the 50th anniversary of man's landing on the moon. And of course, here in Houston, a lot of us are very excited about that. I can remember being a young man, little boy, watching all of this on our black and white television at home and just being mesmerized by the whole event. But along with the technology that NASA had at that time and has evolved to today, what we're seeing is exactly the same as we went from what we would call the old mechanical and analog technologies to the beginning of what we would call the digital age back then. And, you know, I'm sure I'm going to leave somebody's favorite computer hardware off my list here, but I took a few moments to try to go back and recall some of the systems that I saw over time. And many of those are listed here. You may have your own favorite that's not there. I'm, again, going to apologize, but we saw quite an evolution from the 70s into the 80s with, you know, the mainframes, and then you had the evolution of the mini computers. IBM came out with about 5, 6, 7, 8 different versions of what they called their mini computers. You had the DEC-VAX environments. About this time, the PCs came along. You had all kinds of versions of this, and some are not around anymore. Servers, networks, Lotus Notes, SharePoint began to evolve, which brings us a little bit closer to today when we talk about things like cloud, laptops, tablets, iPhone, and apps, right? So all of this has been going on for quite a while. It didn't just start over the last 10 years or so. This has been an ongoing evolution, and I think what it does is it leads us to some important concepts that we need to know. First, software has to change with each advancement in the hardware. And the other thing that's taken place is interconnectivity, which has been evolving also at a very rapid pace, is impacting itself on the software as well. You know, good software, as it says here, is very hard to build, and there's all kinds of examples of failed software products, you know, missing timelines, budgets, or didn't perform as someone once thought it would be. And then comes the, you know, the commodity of the hardware. And what you're seeing today is now the software is really what we're trying to use to make decisions about our business vision, what we're going to try to use technology for to help make us different or differentiate ourselves. And this is really important for you as you consider what I'm going to do. And I have a great example of this. I love, you know, the smartphone industry. I was an early adopter of that. And I have an older version of a smartphone. And, you know, I keep getting all these ads thrown at me like upgrade to, you know, this phone X or that phone Samsung or Apple this or whatever it is. But my phone works fine. The caveat is, as long as the software keeps working, and as you might recall, some of the phone vendors have been taking a little heat for kind of forcing people along when maybe they don't really need to. So this is the same concept with you and your business software, right? Make sure you have that firmly planted in your head as you go forward, understanding that the software is really the key. The hardware is really a commodity today, and the cost of hardware has dropped dramatically. So I think that's going to be important for you. And as it says here on the next bullet, the interdependency of the software, whether the obsolescence is planned or real, is really the challenge that we face today. And one of the things that I've noticed probably in the last 3 to 5 years is the rate of change is just unrelenting. And I tell you, it's very difficult to keep up. And I'm a person that prides myself in trying to keep up. So if you have a few other things on your plate during the course of your day, I can imagine the frustration and the concern you might have in terms of what is the right answer and where do I go. So how do we take stock of where we're at? So you're on the software road. To get to your destination, you have to know where you're starting from. So you need a GPS, right? So how do you determine that? So I put together some things that you should probably start working on if you have questions or concerns. And I think, as Tanya mentioned, you'll be able to get these slides later. And so for taking notes, you can do that or get them later. First is, do you know what software release you're on, when it was implemented, and how customized is your solution? Now, some of you may have been involved in the original purchase and you kind of know these answers, and some of you have inherited these situations. You could be dealing with things that are 5 years old, 10 years old, or even older. It's really important for you to know these things because they all have an impact on your decision later on down the road. So I would also make sure that I get that out of the way. There is a term we call the software vendor. So the software vendor, this is the company that actually creates the software. They have a software release and upgrade policy. Do you know what that is as it pertains to your particular business application? And do you know if your version is even still supported by the vendor? I've had some clients that are running versions from 2005, 2007, etc. in 2018 that those versions are no longer supported, but they made the decision that they did not want to upgrade for whatever reason. It was their decision. They feel like it's the right way to go. I think we'll get into that in a minute, a little bit about the pros and cons. That can come back to haunt you in the end. So you really need to understand what releases you're on and what version you're on today, and is the vendor even supporting that? And I would say if you don't know, you need to ask, as it says here, do you know the difference between your partner and your value-added reseller or partner? So these two terms are used interchangeably, but it's very important. Some of you already know this, that's great, and then there might be some that don't. Your partner or your value-added reseller is generally the company that's going to be hired outside of the software vendor that works with you in a professional services relationship, no different than any other group of vendors or people who are hired to support you or consult with you. The vendor is usually the company that's creating the software. They're involved in creating the upgrades and the new releases and the versions, offering you new functionality to the product as you go. You need to understand where you stand with both of those relationships, because later on, if there's any type of a speed bump, it's going to hopefully help you drive yourself to the right decision as you go forward. You really need to have good terms there. I would document your understanding of where you think you are with both of these parties, and we'll get into that in just a second as to why that's important. And lastly, are you using a niche software product? And this is important because there are a number of industries that are not necessarily what I would call mainstream, but they have a particular solution that someone has invested some time and effort into that is no longer being supported, or they've decided that they're just going to maintain what they have. And some of the niche players, not all of them, they don't have the financial depth or the capability or the resources to support a long-term investment. There's a company here in Texas that works in the operations area. They've developed a product that's been around a long time, and they have told their customers that they're not really going to move forward with that. So, looking down the road, if you stay with that particular company, you're running some risk of not being supported someday when you need to either do financials or something blows up and you got to meet a deadline, whatever it might be. Make sure you understand this niche relationship very well, and that's something that you've given some good thought to. So how do you know when it's time to make a change in your current state? Well, very simply, you've received an end of notice regarding your software or your package, or your vendor no longer supports the software or the platform and the infrastructure that you're on. And this is important because a number of people have invested in what we call an on-premise, or something you have in-house, solution for IT, and the software industry today is totally moving towards a cloud solution performance-based product. And that's going to change a lot of dynamics around personnel and hiring and the investments that people make. You need to be aware of that. So if your vendor has said we're moving to this, or we're no longer going to support you, that you need to understand that. We actually have a customer who reached out to their software vendor over a year ago and told them we'd like to know where we're going, and the vendor told them, yes, we're going to do this, etc. Well, lo and behold, 6 months after they made that notice, they sent another letter to them saying that, no, we've decided we're not going to do that. Luckily, our clients got enough time to kind of, get their forces organized and plan for an orderly transition to something else. But that could have been a very nasty situation if that announcement had come in much later than it did. And so this is a really important reason why I said earlier that you need to make sure you understand these relationships with your vendor and your partner, because you're counting on them to be totally transparent with you. The next point, as I mentioned, I covered just a second ago, the entire industry is moving towards the cloud. It's just the way we're going. The companies have decided that that's what they want to invest in. Hardware has been commoditized. They have major farms, what they call server farms and data centers and such, and so this is where we're moving. Some of you might have security concerns about that. If you have some questions about that, we can talk about that offline. But that's where the industry is going. This next point is very important as well. As you move forward in the time, how are you going to find the talent to support an out-of-date solution or something that's been around quite a while? And, I have a client friend that reached out to me and said his buddy runs another company. They run an AS400. That's a great system. I understand that. He says, they've got about 6, 7 guys that support it, and they're happy with it. And I said, hey, if he's happy, that's great, but make sure he does a proper risk assessment, because when a couple of them retire or maybe somebody decides to move, there's not a lot of AS400 people walking around that can drop in and make that work for them. So there is a little bit of risk by keeping that system. If he likes his system, that's great. Just understand what you're dealing with longer term. This last point is something that I think really sharp HR departments have picked up on. This is when you're hiring people and you want to retain people, it's really important for you to understand what the impact of technology is for your employees. My granddaughters today are 2, 4, and 6, and they work through an iPad like I flip through a book. And they are very astute using the technology, and they're very comfortable with it. I can't even imagine what they're going to be like when they're 24 or 25. The people that are 24 or 25 today were running computers when they were in college. So they're already ahead of the game, because when they come out of college, they are so much farther along than those of us that were maybe 10 or 15 years ahead of them in terms of being comfortable and capable. Today's workforce expects and demands dynamic, real-time access from any location on any device. Those are the kinds of people that are going to want to work for you, and you'd better have a solution for them that matches up. Otherwise, it's going to be a real challenge. The competition for talent is going to be the #1 challenge for companies in the next 15 to 20 years. There's going to be a talent shortage, and it's going to get to be real interesting to see who's willing to make the investments to win those battles. So now the ultimate question: do we upgrade or do we replace? So let's take a more positive spin on this very difficult topic, and I'm just going to go over the pros of each. I've got a couple of slides for each. As Tanya indicated, your mileage might vary for your particular situation, but I think there's a foundation here from which you can build from. If you have questions, you can certainly, reach out to me later. So let's jump into this. If you're less than 24 months or 2 releases or less behind, you're in the ball game in terms of an upgrade. If you've controlled the customizations, that's also a positive. And there's some numbering around that. I put 100 modified objects. That's a really loaded word for a programmer, but really what that means is programming logic. You've looked at your business plan, you've looked at your vision, where you want to be, and you feel that upgrading your current package will meet all of your requirements in terms of your business plan, real-time processing, and some of the new things we want to accomplish. And customizations are going to be reduced or eliminated. So you're going to try to leave behind some of those things that you've done in the past. Some additional pros: Actually, there's been some wording out there from a couple of software vendors that says we're going to move you from X to Z, but it's going to involve a 12-step program, and it's going to have some complicated interim movements, and you're going to go to this version and that version. You know what? You haven't done anything wrong. You don't need to be on a 12-step program. You need to know how I'm going to go from this to this. That type of an answer helps no one but the software vendor and the partner. That's not a good long-term solution. So you need to think about that if you're getting that kind of talk from someone. Ask yourself, is the partner going to use contract or offshore personnel to complete your upgrade? Really important question. Lots of issues around this. We could have a webinar just on that topic alone. Your estimated budget for the upgrade should be a lot less than the original services implementation. I would say a starting point is 40% or less. If you're going to pay more than 40% or you're going to go the same as the original services cost, I'm not sure that's a candidate for an upgrade. Lastly, this is very important on an upgrade question. You have a high degree of confidence and a great relationship with both your vendor and your partner. And I know a number of you do probably have great relationships. That's like the fundamental starting point. And then we've factored in those others. Now, the pros of replacement. If you've gotten a Dear John letter or you've received an end-of-life letter, it's time to start planning the divorce, right? You don't need to try to have some reconciliation here. If you've had ongoing communication problems or you're not getting the support like you thought, I actually had a client from the West Coast that I was working on, the software company here in Houston. They just spent $500,000. They can't get someone to return a help desk call. It's unbelievable that they can't even get someone to return a call. I think that's customer service is paramount in this. So if you're having any kind of support or communication issues, it's time to rethink that relationship. If you're looking to reset expectations or zero base yourself, it's time to consider a replacement. A lot of people put in a new system, but they put in the old system repackaged to fit the new types of windows and screens, but it's really the same way of doing an old process. I think it's time to kind of put that thinking away and ask yourself, are we having siloed off systems? Are we dropping stuff into spreadsheets? And lastly here is it says, how many versions of the truth do you get on something simple as what's the balance? If you can't get confidence in your numbers and you're getting these what I call multiple versions of the truth, these are indications that you need to be thinking about replacing your system. If you're looking at your business vision and how you want to enable your employees, the functionality of new systems today will meet those goals. There are several solutions out there that can do that, and I think you'll find that the people will embrace these new concepts. If you find yourself with an over-reliance on key personnel, this is pretty scary. This has actually happened in a couple of situations where some people have gotten ill or they were transferred, and organizations have had to spend a lot of consulting money to try to, crutch up the system until they can figure out where they want to go. Try to make sure you understand, are we overly vulnerable to that kind of situation? Auditors are now starting to utilize new technology and new tools. They're leveraging it because you're putting pressure on them to lower their audit costs. They're going to start coming back to you saying that your system is too difficult to audit and it's costing you more time and money, and therefore you need to be thinking about how can I have a system that's going to help make their life better and easier and have a lot more controls and a lot easier capability to see the source documents. Again, as I mentioned earlier, really smart HR functions have taken hold of this. Exit interviews, you want to find out what people are thinking about what they thought about the software. Is it easy to use? Did they like it? Etc. And in some cases, you have green screen technology. Some screens don't have what I would call the user interface or the functionality to be much more easier. And there are some folks that are still running some green screen technology. I understand why some of you are there. There's some budget constraints. But that's really something that we really need to challenge going forward. It's going to continue to be difficult. And I mentioned the competition for talent. People don't want to work with those systems, and so that's going to be a really big thing for you to think about. So people and change management. A number of you raised this particular point. I wanted to talk about this, and I consider this probably one of the top 2 or 3 criteria for a successful implementation project: how well the people are prepared and how committed are they to it. I already mentioned this one particular point about the competition for talent, but remember, you're not just hiring for today, for the next 2, 5, etc. years. What are we doing today that's going to attract those people in the future to our organization? Many of you have heard this little saying where the CFO and the CEO are together, and the CFO says, what happens if we train our people and they leave? And then the CEO says, what happens if we don't and they stay? This is a big deal. You know, people are going to resist change, but you have to make the investment in the people to bring them along, and this is an important part of a successful do we upgrade or replace project. This whole section needs to be thought about in terms of when we make the investment. There are reasons to upgrade. Cutting corners on trading is not one of them. Okay, don't accept the fact that people don't want to change. That's why we're upgrading. So that's what I'm trying to say there. Research has suggested that 60% of implementation failures are due to change management issues. I like to use the word resource optimization instead. So when you're going through this type of process, whether you're going to do an upgrade or replace, make sure you take a look at these 4 points in terms of how I'm going to attack this and keep people aware of what's going on. So now your future state, the next steps. So, as I mentioned, if you've received an end-of-life notice or Dear John letter, you need to start planning your options immediately. Don't get caught. My client almost got caught in a really bad situation there where they had less than 24 months to make a decision. Luckily, they got enough notice that I think they can get it done in 18 months. They're a very large organization, and their software vendor really didn't do them any favors. So luckily, we were able to handle that in enough time. Take stock of where you are. Make sure you understand your current state. You cannot make a decision until you have all of that well documented. You might consider an independent IT and business process assessment of your current implementation and your business processes along with your future state considerations. A lot of folks have asked that question. I agree, you need to be doing that. Consider the pros and cons. I gave you some foundational outline there for that. That's pretty standard stuff. A lot of you have probably already thought about a lot of that, but that's really where you start from. You have to kind of evaluate the pros and cons of that. Lastly, get your future vision in your head and then try to put together a budget. Make sure you understand the timetable, the resources, and the dollars, and what type of solution set makes sense for your organization. As I mentioned, I like to use the term resource optimization. Get that program up and running as early as you make the decision and involve many people in terms of communicating what you're planning to do. That will help get the buy-in in terms of establishing street cred with your personnel. You would definitely need to get your funding and budgetary approvals before you go forward. You will need a project management office, or what we call a PMO. This is something that is a must as you go forward. There's so many things going on here that someone internal to the organization needs to own this. You can start a vendor selection and evaluation program, make a decision, and then begin. My contact information is here. It'll be on the slides when you download them. And that concludes my formal presentation, Tanya.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really benefited from that information, Greg, and I think our audience really will find this useful. Just a starting place, a starting point for them on their journey to a new system or a new solution. So as Greg mentioned, this concludes the information portion of our program. We did have a couple questions in the Q&A, so if you'd like to stay with us as we go through these, now would be a good time. So let's see. How about this one? So you mentioned that there's a lot of information about being concerned about offshore programmers. What would be the top concerns?
Well, I think there's a couple of issues here. One is that when someone outside of your control works with your information and your data, you need to be protected, right? And so in the United States, usually we have some types of terms and conditions or contractual terms that we have when we work with our customers. The enforcement of those follows, litigation. I'm not an attorney or anything like that, but certainly you have some degree of confidence that if those terms and conditions aren't violated. When you deal with someone overseas, you are really kind of running your risk there in terms of not necessarily having any recourse in case of confidentiality. How good are those people going to be in terms of maintaining? So the security and confidentiality of your information. So I think it boils down to a couple of things. The highest and most concerning is security and confidentiality. We've all read about stories about overseas people and what they do, and they're hacking in, etc. Where does your data and where do your programs go, and how do you know they're maintained? That's a really important question. And lastly, what is your recourse to pursue in the event that someone violates your trust and utilizes some of that information?
Wow, great. I do have a couple more, but let's just take one more. What should I do if my vendor or partner is evasive about telling me where I stand about my software?
So that's a really good question. Because of some of the stuff that's happened recently, there are a number of topics that are floating around out there, so to speak, inside what they would call the user communities. So if your vendor or your partner are not telling you what's going on with the software, or you're hearing some rumors, there's usually a user group that's out there. Most of the major vendors have user groups, and you can log in, and if you're a user of the software, you can usually get an account for little or no charge, and just ask some of the other users, what are you hearing? What's happening? I've heard this rumor. I've heard that we're going to go through this 12-step program. I'm not really up for that. So I think you can reach out to the user community, and they'll tell you what's going on. And I think that there probably are other folks that are in the business that you can reach out to, and they'll tell you what they know. I think that the thing that you're seeing is that there is a large push towards the cloud, and some of the software vendors have invested pretty heavily in some on-prem solutions, and some of the software people that support them as well. So I think they're going to be evasive because they're not quite sure they like the program or the plans, or they don't feel like they have a good answer.
Oh, good to know. Thank you again, and thank you all for joining us. And this concludes our program for today.